Prepare to journey with me through a story so dark it seemed destined never to be told. An old photograph, yellowed by time, held a secret that no one dared reveal for decades. What should have been merely a memento of a happy marriage, transformed into something far more disturbing. This video is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. It's 1904 in the misty hills of Missouri, where small communities lived isolated among deep valleys and dense forests. The Ozarks region was known for its ancient traditions, ingrained superstitions, and stories people preferred to whisper only when the sun still shone. That autumn, as the leaves began to fall and the icy air heralded the harsh winter, a couple decided to unite their lives in matrimony. The ceremony took place in a creaking wooden chapel, built decades earlier by settlers seeking refuge in the mountains. The itinerant photographer, a man who traveled from county to county with his heavy camera and glass plates, was hired to immortalize that moment. He set up his equipment with the precision of someone who had repeated the ritual hundreds of times, adjusted the light coming through the narrow windows, and positioned the couple against a dark background. The bride wore a simple yet elegant dress, with delicate lace that contrasted with the rustic setting. The groom, in a dark suit and neatly adjusted tie, maintained a serious expression, as was customary at the time. Smiling for photographs was not yet commonplace, and people believed that portraits should capture the solemnity of the moment. The photographer asked them to remain still, as any movement would ruin the image during the long exposure time required. The click of the camera echoed in the silent chapel. When the plate was developed days later, the photographer examined the result with professional satisfaction. The image was sharp, the couple perfectly framed, the light balanced. Everything seemed impeccable until he noticed something strange in the upper right corner of the photograph. An undefined shape, a silhouette that shouldn't be there. He ran his fingers over the glass plate, thinking it was some defect in the material, or perhaps dust that had compromised the development. But it was nothing of the sort. The shadow was incorporated into the image, as if someone had been present at the exact moment of the click, observing the couple from an impossible angle. The photographer felt a chill run down his spine. He knew his art. He mastered every step of the process, and this made no technical sense. No one else was in the chapel during the session. The doors were closed, the windows covered to control the light. So where did that shadowy presence that seemed to float behind the couple come from? He decided not to mention the anomaly to the couple when he handed them the photograph. After all, it was a day of celebration, and bringing up something so disturbing would be inappropriate. But the image haunted him. Night after night, he revisited that moment in his memory, trying to find a logical explanation. Perhaps a curtain he hadn't noticed, perhaps a trick of the light reflecting off some surface. But the more he analyzed it, the more evident it became that the shadow had a human shape, with defined shoulders and what appeared to be a tilted head, as if it were attentively observing the scene. The following months brought strange reports from that region. Other photographers working in the Ozarks began to find similar anomalies in their images. Blurred figures, inexplicable shadows, spots that resembled faces or human silhouettes. The people of the community, deeply superstitious, had their own theories. They spoke of spirits that had inhabited the mountains since time immemorial, entities that observed the living with curiosity, or perhaps with darker intentions. They said that certain photographs could capture what the human eye could not see, revealing layers of reality that should remain hidden. The wedding photograph was kept in a drawer, wrapped in thin fabric, as if the couple themselves sensed that something in that image demanded distance. For weeks, they avoided looking directly at it. When they finally mustered the courage, they sat at the kitchen table under the dim light of a lamp and unwrapped the portrait with trembling hands. There was the shadow exactly where it shouldn't be. It seemed more defined now, as if it were taking shape with each observation. The husband suggested they contact the photographer again, but the wife vehemently refused. Something inside her whispered that the less attention they paid to it, the better. In the weeks that followed, the couple's life began to change in subtle but unsettling ways. Objects they left in certain places appeared out of place. Doors they locked at night would be found ajar in the morning. The wind that entered through the cracks in the house carried sounds reminiscent of whispers, words that almost formed but never quite made complete sense. The wife would wake up in the middle of the night with the feeling that someone was watching her from the corner of the room. But when she lit the candle, She found only shadows dancing on the wooden walls. The husband, a practical man not given to superstitions, tried to rationalize each occurrence. Strong winds in the mountains explained the gates. Faulty memory justified the moved objects. But even he couldn't ignore the strange weight that hung over the house, an invisible presence that made the air thicker. In 1905, when spring finally melted the last accumulated snows in the valleys, the couple decided to seek out an elderly woman who lived in an isolated cabin 3 miles into the forest. She was known in the region for understanding things that defied common logic, for seeing beyond appearances and interpreting signs that others ignored. The path to her dwelling was steep and surrounded by ancient trees whose intertwined branches blocked the sunlight even at midday. When they arrived, they found the woman sitting on a bench in front of her house, as if she had been waiting for them. She showed no surprise at seeing them. Her eyes, clouded by old age, seemed to penetrate beyond the words they nervously mumbled. The couple showed the photograph. The old woman held it with gnarled fingers and examined it at length, bringing it close to her face, then pulling it away again. She said nothing for several minutes, and the silence among the trees became almost unbearable. Finally, she returned the image and spoke in a hoarse voice heavy with meaning. She said that certain presences are drawn to moments of intense emotion, to occasions where life changes direction. Weddings, births, farewells, all these created openings, gaps through which things from other planes could peek. The shadow in the photograph was not necessarily malevolent, she explained, but neither was it benign. It was simply something that existed in parallel, observing, waiting, perhaps yearning for something it could never have again. The old woman advised them to keep the photograph hidden, not to expose it to light frequently, and to avoid talking about it with other people. The more attention they gave to that presence, the stronger it would become. It was like feeding a flame with dry wood. Eventually, if ignored, the presence would lose interest and dissipate, returning to wherever it had come from. But if they continued to feed it with fear, curiosity, or obsession, it would become a permanent part of their lives, an invisible companion that would never leave them. The couple returned home, carrying the old woman's words like a heavy burden. They followed her advice to the letter. The photograph was locked in a trunk in the attic, covered with old blankets and deliberately forgotten. For months they made a point of not mentioning the matter, of not allowing thoughts of the shadow to occupy their minds. Gradually, the disturbances lessened. The doors remained closed. Objects stayed where they were left. The feeling of being watched faded like morning mist under the sun. The years passed with the deceptive tranquility of seasons succeeding one another without incident. The couple built their life through hard work, cultivating the rocky land of the Ozarks and putting down deep roots in that isolated community. The photograph remained forgotten in the attic, buried under layers of old blankets and dusty trunks. They rarely went up there, and when they did, they averted their eyes from that specific area, as if a silent agreement prevented them from touching on that subject again. In 1912, a storm of unusual proportions struck the region. Howling winds ripped off roof tiles, uprooted centuries-old trees, and turned dirt paths into rivers of mud. The couple's house withstood the storm, but the roof suffered considerable damage. When the calm finally arrived, and the sun timidly shone again between scattered clouds, the husband went up to the attic to check if rainwater had seeped into the damaged structure. He found puddles scattered across the wooden floor, leaks staining everything around. And there, in the corner where they had never looked again, the trunk was open. He couldn't remember leaving it like that. He was absolutely certain he'd locked it years before, but there it was, wide open, the blankets thrown aside, and the photograph exposed, as if someone had deliberately discovered it. The image was intact, protected from the damp by some inexplicable chance. He picked it up reluctantly, feeling that familiar weight from years ago return to his chest. The shadow was still there, as sharp as the first time, perhaps even more defined. Its contours seemed to have gained details he didn't recall seeing before. He descended the stairs slowly, holding the photograph away from his body, as if it could contaminate it with something invisible. His wife was in the kitchen preparing tea when she saw him enter, with that object in his hands. Her face instantly paled. She dropped the cup she was holding, which shattered into 1,000 fragments on the floor. They didn't need to exchange words to understand what that meant. They had broken the agreement. The presence had been awakened again. That same night, the phenomena began again with renewed intensity. Footsteps echoed through the empty hallways of the house. Shadows moved independently of light sources. The air grew icy in certain rooms for no apparent reason, even with all the windows closed. The wife swore she heard heavy breathing beside her when she lay down to sleep, but upon turning over, she found only the dark emptiness of the room. The husband would wake up with the sensation of cold fingers touching his face, light traces like spiderwebs that disappeared the instant he fully opened his eyes. They returned to search for the old woman, desperate for guidance. But when they arrived at the clearing where her hut had stood, they found only ruins. The structure had collapsed, consumed by time and neglect. Branches and leaves covered the remains of what had once been her refuge. The nearest neighbors reported that she had left years before, driven by old age or perhaps by something more mysterious. No one knew for sure, and the stories varied depending on who told them. Without guidance, the couple had to find their own answers. They spent sleepless nights studying old books they managed to borrow from a library in a neighboring county, volumes on mountain folklore, forgotten traditions, and protective rituals. They discovered that photographs were considered portals in some ancient cultures, windows that allowed passage between worlds. The act of capturing an image created a permanent connection, an invisible thread linking the moment frozen in time to present reality. And if something intruded on that moment, as the shadow had done, that connection became corrupted, disturbed in ways that few understood. The solution, according to one of the texts they found, was to completely sever the connection. But this required more than simply destroying the photograph. It demanded a specific ritual, performed under precise conditions with elements that needed to be carefully gathered. And above all, it required the courage to confront directly what they had spent years trying to avoid. The preparation took weeks. The couple needed to gather specific elements mentioned in ancient texts: salt extracted from natural mountain springs, herbs that grew only under the light of the full moon, water collected before dawn from a stream that never dried up. Each ingredient carried its own symbolism, its own connection to forces that existed beyond common understanding. They walked through the valleys and forests of the Ozarks with baskets in hand, searching for plants with silvery leaves and deep roots, collecting smooth stones from forgotten riverbeds. During this period, his presence in the house intensified even further. It was as if he perceived their intentions, as if he sensed that something was about to change. The manifestations became bolder, more direct. Objects not only moved, but were thrown. Doors slammed shut with enough force to tear off their hinges. The photograph, which they had placed in a locked drawer, inexplicably appeared in different places in the house: on the kitchen table in the morning, leaning against the rocking chair in the living room at dusk, inside the wardrobe when they were getting dressed, as if his presence wanted to constantly remind them of his existence, of his dominion over that space. The wife began having disturbing dreams. She saw herself standing in the chapel where they had married, but everything was different. The walls dripped with dark dampness. The air smelled of churned earth, and where there had once been polished wooden benches, now twisted roots sprouted from the ground. On the altar, the shadow of the photograph took on a three-dimensional form, becoming a silhouette that moved slowly towards her. She would wake up with her heart racing, cold sweat covering her forehead, the sensation of the presence still palpable in the dark room. The husband, in turn, began to notice changes in his own reflection. When passing in front of mirrors or polished surfaces, he would sometimes catch a strange movement on the periphery of the image, something behind him that shouldn't be there, a shadow that didn't match his own form. He stopped looking in mirrors whenever possible, avoiding windows at night where his reflection might appear against the dark glass. Finally, on an autumn night in 1913, when the moon was full and the sky clear of clouds, they gathered everything they needed. The ritual was to be performed outdoors, in a place where the earth had not been touched by human constructions. They chose a clearing on a hilltop, far from any trail, surrounded by ancient trees whose trunks were too wide for two people to fully embrace. The wind blew icy, carrying the scent of dry leaves and damp earth. They drew a circle on the ground using mountain salt, creating a barrier that, according to the texts, no presence could cross. Inside the circle, they built a small fire with dry branches and lit it with flint. The flames danced erratically, casting long, distorted shadows on the surrounding trees. They placed the photograph in the center, resting on a flat stone. Even in the flickering light of the fire, the shadow on the image was perfectly visible, like a dark spot that absorbed the light instead of reflecting it. Following the instructions meticulously, the wife scattered the herbs around the photograph, while the husband poured the water collected from the stream, creating a specific pattern that the texts described as a symbol of undoing, of breaking ties. They needed to recite ancient words, phrases in a language neither of them fully understood, but which they had memorized with obsessive care. The words came out hesitantly at first, then gained rhythm, creating a strange melody that echoed through the silent forest. The temperature plummeted drastically. The air around the circle became so cold that their breaths formed dense clouds of vapor. The flames of the bonfire diminished, almost extinguishing themselves, then suddenly rose with renewed force higher than they should have been. The photograph began to tremble, as if touched by a breeze that didn't exist within the protected circle, and then they saw it. The shadow began to move within the image, detaching itself from the static background, gaining independent movement. The couple continued reciting the ancient words, their voices trembling not only from the bone-chilling cold, but from the growing terror of what they were witnessing. The shadow in the photograph rippled like smoke trapped inside a glass container, expanding and contracting in a rhythm reminiscent of breathing. The flames of the bonfire changed color, shifting from ordinary orange to bluish and greenish hues that illuminated the clearing with a ghostly light. The surrounding trees seemed to lean closer, like silent spectators watching a forbidden spectacle. Something began to emerge from the very air within the circle. It wasn't directly visible, but it could be perceived by the way it distorted the surrounding space, like heat trembling over hot stones in the middle of summer. The presence was materializing, attempting to break through the barrier between its plane of existence and the physical world. The salt on the ground began to glow with a faint pulsating light, as if resisting immense pressure. Tiny cracks formed in the circular pattern, thin as strands of hair, but growing slowly. The wife gripped her husband's hand tightly enough to leave marks. They couldn't stop now. To stop would mean leaving the ritual incomplete, and the texts had been clear about the consequences of that. It would be worse than never having started it at all. They raised their voices above the wind that had begun to swirl around the clearing, carrying whispers that almost formed recognizable words. It was as if the entire forest had awakened, attentive to what was unfolding on that hilltop. The photograph began to darken, not just the shadow, but the entire image, as if black ink were being poured over it from an invisible source. The bride's face, the groom's features, the background of the chapel, everything was consumed by that darkness that spread like an oil slick on water. In a few moments, only a completely black rectangle remained without any visible detail, and then, as suddenly as it had all begun, the glass plate shattered. The sound was deafening in the stillness of the night. Thousands of tiny fragments exploded in all directions, but strangely, none crossed the barrier of the salt circle. The pieces fell to the ground like a rain of crystal, reflecting the light of the bonfire in countless bright points. The wind ceased instantly. The flames returned to their natural color. The temperature began to rise slowly, restoring sensation to the couple's numb fingers. They remained motionless for a long time, fearing that any movement might undo what they had achieved. Slowly, when nothing else happened, they left the circle. Their feet cracked the shards of glass on the floor, reducing them to fine dust. The feeling of oppression they had carried for years had vanished. The air seemed lighter, cleaner, as after a storm that washes away all the accumulated dust. They returned home as the first light of dawn began to tinge the horizon with pink and gold. The walk through the forest was different. The nocturnal sounds had ceased, replaced by the awakening of birds and the soft rustling of small animals among the undergrowth. The house, when they spotted it among the trees, seemed different too. It hadn't changed physically, but something intangible had shifted. It no longer carried that invisible weight, that dense atmosphere that enveloped it like a heavy cloak. In the following days, they confirmed that the presence had definitively departed. No door opened on its own. No object mysteriously moved. The disturbing dreams ceased, replaced by the deep, restorative sleep they hadn't experienced in years. The wife began to sing again while working in the kitchen. The husband whistled old melodies while repairing fences and tending the land. It was as if a spell had been broken, restoring the life the shadow had slowly consumed. But they knew they couldn't forget completely. Certain experiences leave invisible marks, scars on the soul that never fully disappear. They had looked at something that shouldn't be seen, touched forces that most people spend their entire lives unaware exist. And this awareness changed a person in subtle but permanent ways. The years that followed brought a peace the couple had almost forgotten was possible. Life in the Ozarks Mountains resumed its natural rhythm, marked by seasons that alternated with comforting regularity. Rainy springs gave way to hot summers, which yielded to golden autumns. followed by winters that blanketed the valleys in white. The couple grew old together, their grey hair and deep wrinkles becoming silent witnesses to the relentless passage of time. In 1928, when both were over 50 years old, they began receiving visits from people in the community seeking advice. The story of what they had faced, though never told in detail, had spread through the whispers typical of small places, where secrets travel faster than the wind between the mountains. People with their own inexplicable experiences, their own encounters with phenomena that defied logic, knocked on the door seeking guidance. There was the farmer whose new house, built on land that was once dense forest, seemed to reject his presence. Tools disappeared and reappeared in impossible places. Farm animals refused to enter the barn for no apparent reason. At night, the sound of footsteps echoed through the empty upper floor. The man arrived with deep-set eyes from sleepless nights, trembling hands clutching a worn hat. The couple listened to his story patiently, recognizing in it echoes of their own experience. They explained that certain places hold memories, that the land doesn't always forget what came before. They advised simple rituals of cleansing and respect, ways to make peace with whatever inhabited that space before the boards and nails took its place. There was also the widow, who had inherited an antique mirror from her late aunt, an ornate piece with a dark wooden frame carved with figures that seemed to shift position when not looked at directly. She swore she saw movements in the reflection that didn't correspond to reality, shadows that crossed the glass when she was alone. Some mornings, she would wake up and find the mirror turned towards the wall, even though she was sure to leave it in its normal position before going to sleep. The couple's wife examined the object carefully, running her fingers over the deep carvings, feeling the strange energy emanating from the piece. She recommended that it be covered with a dark cloth at night and never kept in bedrooms where people slept. Some objects, she explained, carry stories that are not their own to tell, memories absorbed through decades of witnessing the lives of others. Each visitor brought a new story, a new variation on the theme the couple knew so well. A man whose pocket watch, inherited from his grandfather, always stopped exactly at midnight regardless of how many times it was repaired. A woman whose family photographs showed blurred faces of only certain people, as if something didn't want them to be remembered clearly. A young couple who heard music coming from the walls of their house, old melodies that no one else played anymore, songs from an era that had passed decades ago. The couple attended to everyone with generosity, sharing not only practical advice, but also something more valuable, the validation that their experiences were real, that they were not losing their sanity. In a world increasingly focused on machines and scientific explanations, where progress left little room for mysteries, these people desperately needed someone who understood that some things exist beyond what can be measured or quantified. But there was one type of visitor the couple learned to refuse, those who came not seeking help, but driven by morbid curiosity. People who wanted to hear sordid details, who delighted in the suffering of others, who saw the supernatural as entertainment instead of something deserving of respect and caution. One man appeared once asking to be taught how to conjure presences, how to deliberately open portals. He spoke with feverish enthusiasm about communicating with the other side, about proving the existence of parallel dimensions. The husband dismissed him firmly, explaining that playing with such forces was like playing with fire in a dry forest. What seemed fascinating from a distance became terrifying when it truly manifested. As the 1930s approached, the couple realized that their story had taken on a life of its own in the community. Distorted versions circulated, each account adding elements that had never happened. Some said they had faced demons, others that they had made pacts with entities to gain special powers. Stories spoke of strange lights seen on their property at night, of voices singing in forgotten languages, of apparitions of spectral figures on their porch. None of this was true, but human imagination always fills in the gaps of the unknown with its own fantastical creations. They learned to live with the reputation they had unintentionally acquired. Some people would cross the street to avoid them, making protective hand gestures when they saw them. Others sought their company specifically because of the stories, wanting to be near something they considered special or mystical. The couple simply continued their lives, cultivating their land, caring for each other, and helping those who genuinely needed it when they appeared at their door. One thing, however, remained constant throughout all those years. They never again allowed any photographer to portray them. When someone suggested taking a picture to preserve memories or document events, they politely but firmly refused. They had learned that some images are best kept only in memory, where they cannot be corrupted by forces that observe from places that should not exist. The lesson that wedding photography had taught remained deeply engraved in their souls, a constant reminder that not everything that can be captured should be captured. The early 1930s brought significant changes to the Ozarks region. Roads that were once just dirt tracks began to be paved, connecting isolated communities to the wider world beyond the mountains. Automobiles became more common, their engines roaring through valleys that had previously known only the sound of horse-drawn carts. Electricity arrived slowly, transforming nights once lit only by lamps and candles into spaces bathed in constant artificial light. The world was changing, modernizing at a pace that left many long-time inhabitants disoriented. The couple observed these transformations with mixed feelings. On the one hand, they appreciated certain conveniences that modernity brought. They no longer needed to fetch water from distant wells. Pumps made the job easier. They no longer depended exclusively on wood fires when winter punished them with sub-zero temperatures. On the other hand, they felt that something essential was being lost in this race towards progress. People no longer chatted on their porches at dusk as they once did. They didn't gather to tell old stories while the fire crackled. They were always in a hurry, always chasing something invisible that promised satisfaction but never seemed to deliver it completely. In 1932, an unexpected event brought the past back to the surface abruptly. A man arrived at the couple's property on a rainy April afternoon, driving a black car that gleamed even under the grey sky. He introduced himself as an antique collector and said he had heard fascinating stories about them during his travels in the region. He was particularly interested in old photographs, especially those with unusual features or technical anomalies. He explained that such images were invaluable to scholars, trying to understand the limitations and peculiarities of early photographic techniques. The husband greeted the visitor with superficial cordiality, but an immediate tension settled in his shoulders. Something about that man didn't seem right. His eyes were too attentive, examining every corner of the house with an intensity that went beyond mere curiosity. His questions, though politely worded, sought information too specific to be casual. He wanted to know about that particular wedding photograph, describing details that only someone who had seen it could know. He spoke of an inexplicable shadow, of how such an image would be of inestimable value to his collection. The wife joined the conversation and, in a firm but polite voice, informed him that the photograph no longer existed. It had been destroyed years ago, fragmented into thousands of pieces, scattered by the wind across the forest. The collector received this information with visible disappointment, but something in his expression suggested that he didn't completely believe the story. He persisted, offering sums of money that would be considerable for anyone in that region, especially in economically difficult times. He spoke about how much that image could be worth, how it would be properly preserved and studied by competent people. The couple stood firm in their refusal. It wasn't a matter of money. Some things were priceless because their value couldn't be measured in monetary terms. The danger that photograph represented, even destroyed, was too real in their memories. They had lived for years under the influence of that presence, had felt the weight of being constantly watched by something that didn't belong to the natural world. They wouldn't allow it to be unearthed. They wouldn't allow others to potentially face what they had faced. The collector left without finding what he sought, but his visit left a trail of unease. Others began to appear, people with similar interests, all having somehow heard about that specific photograph. Some arrived with strange equipment, devices that supposedly measured invisible energies or detected abnormal presences. They wanted to examine the house, investigate the place where the ritual had been performed. The couple refused them all, becoming increasingly resolute in their isolation. A woman appeared in 1934 claiming to be a medium, someone capable of communicating with planes beyond the physical. She dressed theatrically, with colorful shawls and jewelry that jingled when she moved. She spoke with absolute conviction about how she could help, how she could ensure that no residual presence remained on their property. She offered to hold seances, invoke spiritual protections, create permanent barriers against negative influences. The wife dismissed her politely, but without hesitation. They had learned that true knowledge of such matters rarely came with spectacle or self-promotion. What disturbed the couple most was realizing that their story had been transformed into something marketable. People wanted to profit from their experiences, to turn their suffering into entertainment or an object of study. There was something deeply disrespectful about that, A violation of the intimacy of moments that had been genuinely terrifying. They were not characters in a story for others to consume. They were real people who had faced something real and had paid the emotional price for it. They then decided to do something radical by the standards of the time. They bought the land surrounding their property, significantly expanding their holdings. They created an isolation zone, a buffer between themselves and the world that kept encroaching. They planted trees densely along the new boundaries, creating natural barriers that discouraged casual visitors. They put up signs indicating private property, something that was previously unnecessary in a community where everyone knew the boundaries of each plot, without the need for formal demarcations. This change affected their relationship with the wider community. People who had previously visited them regularly began to distance themselves, interpreting the isolation as rejection. Neighbors with whom they had maintained cordial relations for decades became distant, offended by the perception that the couple considered themselves superior or different. Rumors circulated about what they really did on their expanded, isolated property. Some said they practiced obscure rituals, others that they guarded valuable treasures or secrets. Popular imagination, when lacking concrete facts, fills the void with increasingly elaborate fantasies. The couple endured this ostracism with quiet dignity. They knew people wouldn't understand their true reasons. How could they explain that they needed distance not out of arrogance but for self-preservation? How could they make it understood that certain knowledge is too heavy a burden? That witnessing the inexplicable changes a person in ways that cannot be reversed, it was easier to let them think what they wanted, to create their own narratives, than to try to justify decisions that stemmed from non-transferable experiences. During those years of increasing isolation, the couple found a peace unlike any they had known before. It wasn't the peace of ignorance or denial, but the peace that comes from accepting difficult truths and learning to live with them. They tended their garden, cared for their land, and found comfort in each other's company. Their conversations deepened as they shared an understanding no one else possessed. They had looked into the darkness together and had survived. This shared experience created a bond that transcended ordinary love, forging them into a unity that could withstand any storm. The final years of the 1930s brought with them a profound understanding that the couple had lacked in their youth. They had traversed decades carrying the weight of an experience few could imagine, and this journey had transformed them in ways both visible and invisible. Their wrinkled hands told stories of hard work, but their eyes revealed something deeper, a wisdom gained through confronting forces that defied all conventional logic. They grew old together on that isolated property, surrounded by trees they had planted that now grew tall enough to completely block the view of the nearest road. The couple's daily routine had become almost ritualistic in its simplicity. They woke with the sun. When the golden light began to filter through the heavy curtains, they kept closed at night. The husband lit the stove, while his wife prepared coffee, the rich aroma filling the kitchen and announcing the beginning of a new day. They ate breakfast in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that only exists between people who know each other so deeply that words often become unnecessary. Afterward, they went about their business, he tending to the animals and the upkeep of the buildings, she dedicating herself to the expansive garden she cultivated with almost maternal devotion. This garden had become something extraordinary over the years. It wasn't just a functional space for growing food, but a sanctuary of carefully selected plants, arranged according to principles the wife had learned through her long journey of study. There were herbs that bloomed only under the light of the full moon, their silvery petals trembling in the night breeze. There were deep roots that she harvested with reverent respect, knowing that each one carried specific properties for protection and energetic cleansing. Flowers that attracted specific birds, creating a natural symphony that warded off the feeling of loneliness that could easily consume such an isolated place. The husband, for his part, had developed remarkable skills in working with wood. He created intricate sculptures from tree trunks found in the forest, figures that seemed to emerge naturally from the raw material as if they had always been there, just waiting to be freed. His hands knew every type of tree in the region, knew when the wood was ready to be worked, understood the natural patterns that determined the strength and flexibility of each piece. He built a small workshop behind the main house, where he spent hours lost in deep concentration, the sound of his tools creating its own music that echoed through the trees. But despite this apparent tranquility, there were moments when the past returned in unexpected ways. not through supernatural manifestations or inexplicable events, but through memories that surfaced without warning, bringing with them all the emotional intensity of those terrible days. The wife would sometimes wake in the middle of the night, cold sweat covering her forehead, the echo of dreams where she revisited that chapel from 1904, where it had all begun. In those moments, her husband would embrace her silently, his solid presence serving as an anchor, pulling her back from the abyss of memories that threatened to consume her. He also had his own inner demons. Occasionally, when passing mirrors, he still felt that instinctive urge to look away, a visceral reaction programmed by years of seeing things that shouldn't be reflected. There were days when the weight of everything they had faced seemed overwhelming, when he questioned whether they had made the right choices, whether they should have handled the situation differently. But then he would look at his wife, see the strength and resilience she radiated even in difficult times, and know that they had done the best they could with the knowledge they possessed at the time. In 1938, a particular event once again tested his resolve to keep the past buried. A group of university students from some distant institution appeared on his property, claiming to be conducting research on regional folklore for an academic project. They were young, enthusiastic, full of energy, and convinced that modern science could explain any phenomenon, no matter how strange. They brought notebooks, modern cameras, sound recording equipment that looked like something out of a science fiction novel. They wanted to document stories, collect first-hand accounts, create an archive that would preserve traditions before they were completely forgotten. The group leader, a tall young man with thick-lensed glasses and contagious enthusiasm, explained that they had heard fascinating stories about the couple, about extraordinary experiences they supposedly had lived through. He spoke with genuine respect, without the sensationalism that characterized other previous visitors. There was sincerity in his approach, an academic curiosity that came from an honest place, but even so the couple refused to cooperate. Not out of malice or distrust, but because they knew that some stories shouldn't be told, especially not to people who saw the world exclusively through the lens of scientific reason. The wife explained, with the maternal patience that came from decades of experience, that there were things in the world that resisted documentation, that lost their essence when reduced to words on pages or images in photographs. She spoke about how the quest to rationally understand everything could be dangerous, how there were mysteries that existed better when they remained mysteries. The students listened politely, but it was evident in their expressions that they didn't truly understand. For them, everything was potentially explainable. Every phenomenon had a rational cause awaiting discovery. They hadn't yet learned that the universe was far vaster and stranger than their theories could accommodate. After the students left, disappointed but respectful, the couple sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the distant mountains. The sky was painted in spectacular oranges and purples, the clouds ablaze with the twilight light. It was in moments like these that they felt most clearly the weight of the years, not only in their aging bodies, but in their souls that had witnessed so much. They reflected on how the world continued to change, how each generation believed it had all the answers, only to discover that new questions constantly arose. The husband remarked that perhaps they were wrong to guard their story so zealously. Perhaps sharing it could help others facing similar situations, offering guidance based on lived experience rather than academic theory. The wife considered his words carefully before responding. She agreed that there was value in sharing knowledge, but argued that how the story was told mattered immensely. Telling it as entertainment or scientific curiosity would be a betrayal of its essence. If it were to be shared, it needed to be done with reverence, with an understanding that it was not just a story, but a testament to profound truths about the nature of reality. This conversation planted a seed that would slowly grow over the following years. They began to consider the possibility of documenting their experience, not for curious students or avid collectors, but for those who would genuinely need this information in the future, people who would find themselves in similar situations, facing phenomena that would challenge their sanity, needing validation that they were not alone, that others had weathered similar storms and survived. The wife began to write late at night when the world slept, and only the crackling of the fire in the fireplace broke the silence. She wrote by hand, in leather-bound notebooks, her elegant calligraphy filling pages with carefully recovered memories. She didn't record everything, only the essential elements, the patterns she had identified over the years, the lessons learned through trial and error, She described the signs they had initially ignored, the mistakes they had made out of ignorance, the techniques that worked when they finally found the right guidance. The husband contributed his own observations, complementing her narrative with different perspectives. Together, they created a record that was neither a scientific report nor mere entertainment, but something in between, a practical guide grounded in real experience. They knew they would probably never publish it, but the act of documenting was in itself therapeutic, a way of processing decades of experiences they had carried in silence for too long. As they wrote, they rediscovered details that had been suppressed by memory over the years. Small incidents that seemed insignificant at the time revealed themselves to be important when examined retrospectively. Patterns emerged. Connections became evident. They realized that their journey had not been a random series of frightening events, but a narrative with its own structure, with a beginning, middle, and transformation that had left them permanently altered, but also strangely enriched. The flickering lamplight cast dancing shadows on the walls as they worked, but these shadows were just shadows, without weight or meaning beyond the physical. The presence that had haunted them for so long had definitively departed, leaving only memories and lessons learned. And perhaps that was the most important thing, to understand that even the most terrifying experiences eventually become part of the fabric of our lives, dark threads in a tapestry that also contains vibrant colors and moments of inexplicable beauty. The winter of 1941 arrived with a ferocity that the oldest inhabitants of the Ozarks could not remember ever having seen before. Snow fell continuously for weeks, accumulating in thick layers that transformed the landscape into an endless white sea. Trees bent under the weight of the ice, their branches crisscrossing in intricate patterns that shimmered when rare rays of sunlight managed to penetrate the dense clouds. The cold was so intense that breath froze in the air, forming tiny crystals that floated briefly before disappearing. The couple's property became completely isolated, the roads impassable, communication with the outside world reduced to zero. This forced seclusion brought a meditative quality to the passing days. The couple found themselves truly alone in a way they hadn't experienced in years, without the possibility of unexpected visitors or intrusions from the outside world. It was as if the universe had created a cocoon around them, a protected space where they could exist completely apart from the worries and agitations that consumed other people. They spent their days keeping the fire burning, reading old books from their growing collection, and continuing the documentation work they had begun. It was during this period of profound isolation that something remarkable happened. The wife awoke one morning with a mental clarity she hadn't experienced in decades, as if a veil had been lifted from her thoughts. She understood with absolute certainty that her journey with photography and the presence it contained had not been accidental or random. It had been part of a larger pattern, a lesson the universe needed to teach them for reasons that transcended immediate understanding. All the pain, all the fear, all the sleepless nights had served a purpose that only now, with the perspective of decades, was becoming perceptible. She shared this revelation with her husband as they drank coffee in the warm kitchen, the snow continuing to fall outside the windows. He listened attentively, his wrinkled hands gripping the steaming cup, and confessed that he had recently reached similar conclusions. He spoke of how the experience had forced them to grow in ways they never would have under normal circumstances. They had been confronted with the fragility of their perceptions of reality, with the illusion of control that most people comfortably maintain throughout their lives. This confrontation, though terrifying, had opened their minds to possibilities that remained closed to others. They realized that they had become, without seeking or desiring it, guardians of a specific kind of knowledge. Not academic or theoretical knowledge, but practical wisdom on how to navigate territories where the rational and the inexplicable meet. They had learned to recognize subtle signs that precede manifestations, to identify patterns in events that seemed chaotic, to maintain mental balance when confronted with things that defy all logic. And this knowledge had real value, even if most people went through entire lives without needing it. The conversation expanded into more philosophical territory as the day progressed. They discussed the nature of reality itself, questioning whether what they called the supernatural was truly something outside of nature, or simply aspects of nature that modern science did not yet adequately understand. The husband proposed that perhaps the universe was far vaster and more complex than humans could conceive. with layers of existence operating simultaneously, occasionally intersecting in ways we would perceive as anomalies or impossibilities. The wife agreed, adding that ancient cultures seemed to have a better understanding of these complexities. They accepted that there were mysteries, not as problems to be solved, but as fundamental characteristics of existence. Modernity, with its insistence on explaining and categorizing everything, had created an intellectual arrogance that left people unprepared when confronted with genuinely inexplicable phenomena. The common reaction was denial, or an attempt to force inadequate rational explanations, rather than simply accepting that not everything fit into neat boxes. As they talked, the wife had another important insight. She realized that the shadow in the photograph had never been malevolent in the traditional sense. It wasn't trying to hurt or destroy them. It was simply existing just as they existed, but on a different plane that occasionally bled into theirs. The disturbances they experienced, the objects moved, the doors opened, were not deliberate attacks but side effects of two planes of existence trying to occupy the same space. It was like two radio frequencies interfering with each other, creating noise and distortion. This understanding brought a sense of peace that neither of them had anticipated. For years, they had harbored resentment and fear toward that presence, seeing it as an enemy that needed to be fought. But now they understood that there was no real enemy, only incompatibility, two forms of existence that could not coexist harmoniously in the same space. The ritual they performed did not destroy something evil, but simply separated what should not be intertwined, restoring natural order where there was confusion. This shift in perspective profoundly altered how they felt about the entire experience. What had previously seemed like pure trauma had transformed into something more complex, a difficult journey certainly, but also educational in ways they could not have learned otherwise. They had delved into depths of human experience that remained unknown to the vast majority of people. They had touched upon mysteries that philosophers had contemplated for millennia, and they had survived not only physically, but spiritually intact, perhaps even strengthened. The husband mentioned something he'd been thinking about for weeks. He'd observed that since performing the ritual, since breaking the connection with that presence, they had both developed different sensitivities, not supernatural powers or extraordinary abilities, but heightened perceptions. He could sense when something wasn't right in a place, a subtle vibration indicating imbalance or disturbance. It wasn't something he could logically explain, but he'd learned to trust this intuition. And it rarely disappointed him. The wife confessed to having developed something similar. She could look at old objects, especially photographs, and immediately sense if they carried something beyond the physical. It was as if she could perceive layers of emotional history embedded in items that had witnessed significant events. Some pieces radiated warmth, happy memories of joyful moments. Others had a cold weight, sadness or trauma absorbed over time. This ability had become particularly useful when people came seeking advice, bringing problematic objects they didn't understand. They reflected on how these sensitivities had probably always been present at some level, but dormant, undeveloped. The experience with photography had activated something within them, opening doors of perception that normally remained closed. It was as if they had been forced to develop new senses, to deal with situations that transcended normal perceptual capabilities. And once developed, these senses did not disappear when the crisis passed, but remained as permanent tools in their repertoire. As the snow continued to fall outside, creating a profound silence that enveloped the house like a protective blanket, they began to discuss what they would do with the knowledge and understanding they had accumulated. Simply keeping it to themselves seemed like wasting something valuable, but sharing it indiscriminately would be irresponsible, potentially dangerous. They needed to find a balance, a way to make this wisdom available to those who genuinely needed it, while protecting it from casual curiosity or commercial exploitation. The wife suggested that perhaps they should create something like the ancient texts they had consulted years ago when desperately seeking answers. A guide that future generations could discover if needed, but which would remain hidden from untrained eyes. It wouldn't be published or widely distributed, but it would exist, waiting to be found by those whose circumstances led them to it. It was a romanticized idea, perhaps, but it resonated with both of them as an appropriate approach. The husband expanded on the concept. He proposed that they create not only written text but also physical artifacts, objects imbued with intention and meaning that could serve as practical tools. simple talismans made of natural materials, marked with symbols that had proven effective, instructions on how to prepare spaces for protection, how to recognize signs of danger, how to maintain mental balance when confronted with the impossible, a survival kit essentially. For those who found themselves navigating territories similar to those they had traversed, they spent the rest of that brutal winter working on this project. The wife wrote with meticulous care, choosing each word for maximum precision, avoiding flowery or dramatic language that might discredit the content. The husband worked in his workshop, creating small but meaningful pieces, each representing a specific aspect of protection or cleansing. He carved symbols into wooden discs, assembled sachets with specific herbs that his wife had cultivated, and created diagrams showing how to arrange salt and water in effective patterns. While they worked, they felt more connected than ever. The project gave renewed purpose to their final years, transforming what could have been a period of gradual decline into a time of meaningful creation. They were leaving a legacy, not for fame or recognition, but as genuine service to future strangers who would face similar challenges. It was a form of generosity that expected nothing in return, pure giving motivated only by empathy for those who would suffer as they had suffered. Spring had finally arrived, melting the accumulated snow and revealing land they hadn't seen for months. With the thaw came the first signs of renewal, green shoots pushing through the cold soil, birds returning to build nests, the eternal cycle of life reasserting itself after winter dormancy. The couple observed these transformations with deep appreciation, seeing in them a reflection of their own journey. They too had passed through periods of darkness and cold, but had emerged renewed, different certainly, but also more complete in ways they could not have achieved through easier paths. The years that followed brought a serenity that the couple embraced with silent gratitude. They grew old side by side, witnessing the changing seasons through the windows of their secluded home, watching the trees they had planted grow tall and strong around the property. The world outside continued its relentless march toward the future, but within that mountain refuge, time seemed to move at a different pace, slower, more deliberate. The work they had begun during that harsh winter was completed with care and attention to detail. The notebooks were stored in a safe place, wrapped in fabric and protected from moisture. The objects the husband had created were arranged in a wooden box he had built himself, each piece occupying its specific place. They didn't know if anyone would ever find it, if it would have meaning for future generations, but the act of creating had been enough. They had transformed a painful experience into something potentially useful, and that brought peace. The wife began to dedicate more time to the garden, continually expanding it, adding new varieties of plants that she discovered or received from occasional travelers who still passed through the region. The garden became her living legacy, a place of beauty and purpose, where she could express all the understanding she had accumulated about balance and harmony. Each flower bed was planned with intention, each plant chosen not only for its usefulness, but for how it contributed to the whole. The husband continued working with wood, but his creations became increasingly abstract, less representational. They were forms that suggested movement or emotion without explicitly defining them, leaving room for personal interpretation by the observer. He discovered that he preferred this approach, as it better reflected his understanding that mystery and ambiguity were essential components of existence, not problems to be eliminated. There were moments of deep reflection, when they sat together on the veranda at dusk, watching the sky paint itself in impossible colors as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. In those moments, they talked about their lives, about the choices they had made, about the meaning of everything they had experienced. They agreed that they wouldn't change anything, even if they could. Every hardship, every moment of terror, every sleepless night had contributed to making them who they were now, and who they were now pleased them. The photograph that had started it all remained only in memory, fragmented and scattered by the wind years ago, but its impact persisted, not as trauma, but as a reminder that reality was vaster and stranger than it seemed. This awareness had enriched their lives, not made them poorer. They had seen beyond the veil that separates the ordinary from the extraordinary, and although what they saw was not always comfortable, it was genuine in a way that few human experiences achieve. When people occasionally asked about their history, about the rumors that circulated, they would simply smile and steer the conversation toward other topics. Some secrets were better kept, not out of shame or fear, but out of respect for what they represented. There was dignity in keeping certain things private, in not turning profound experiences into casual entertainment. The house in the mountains remained standing, withstanding storms and the relentless passage of years. Its walls held memories that no visitor could access, stories inscribed not in words, but in the very substance of the place. And perhaps that was fitting. Some narratives don't need to be explicitly told to have meaning. They exist in the shadows between the lines, in the spaces between what is said and what remains unsaid. The couple found peace not in definitive answers, but in accepting that some questions have no answers, or at least no answers that human minds can fully comprehend. And this acceptance brought a freedom they never imagined possible. Freedom to stop searching for explanations for everything, to simply exist in the mystery, to find beauty in uncertainty. Their lives became silent testament to the fact that it is possible to confront the inexplicable and emerge whole. That fear can be traversed, not eliminated but integrated and understood. That experiences that seem destined to destroy can paradoxically build something stronger than what existed before. And so, in the Ozark Mountains, while the world spun and shifted around them, two spirits found what so many seek but few attain: a genuine understanding that life contains layers that transcend simple explanation, and the courage to embrace that truth without flinching. If this journey through darkness and mystery touched something within you, consider subscribing to the channel. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and until the next story that awaits us in the shadows of the unknown.